Okay, hello everyone. Welcome. Dace here of Stonemeat Productions. Today we are going to be reviewing Bloodstained Curse of the Moon for Nintendo Switch. Now, I have a pile of notes here that I'm just itching to get into because there are some major things about this game that I really, really loved, and there were a few things that were just not not cool. So yeah, anyway, we're gonna just get right into this stuff. So, Bloodstained: Curse of the Moon is a retro-style action-adventure, side-scrolling platformer with fantasy medieval themes kind of going on. Created by Koji Igarashi and Inti Creates. So this came out May 24th, sort of as like a side project to tide people over until Bloodstained Ritual of the Night comes out. So anyway, the story, you play Zangetsu. He's the main character. He's like this demon slayer piece of shit who just tours around the world, slaying demons as often as he comes across them. Now what happens is he meets up with some people along the way, like Miriam, Alfredo, or Alfred. I'll just call him Alfredo. And then this vampire by the name of Gebel. So, yeah, he shacks up with those three, and they just go around. They're heading towards this big castle where there's this demon lord who Zangetsu senses this presence and is like, okay, I'm gonna go after this guy or whatever. So that's more or less the story. I'll just get right into some of the other stuff now because there's quite a bit. So the visuals, this is a huge thing for me. Just so good. So fantastic backgrounds. The visuals and the backgrounds in this game are top notch. They did a spectacular job of just nailing it perfectly. For instance, some of the backgrounds have 3 or 4 layers. And for those of you who know me, I'm a sucker for backgrounds, and they just did such a wicked job. For instance, I think in level 2, in the second half, there's this big ice cavern, and there are just these huge pillars of ice. And in the first stage, just the forest, the pine trees, and it's just fantastic. It looks so beautiful. Specifically in the first one, and some of the other levels too, but I'll use an example from the first level. They have really engaging and animated environments and backgrounds. So you have the moon in the background. There's a train going by through the trees, with sound effects, of course, and just all that stuff. So it's just really, really cool. There's one scene where you move across, and in the background there's this lake with the moonlight shimmering on the surface. Just really beautiful stuff. What else can I say about visuals? The enemy design is really cool. You got some really unique enemies. Bosses are awesome. This is a huge highlight in the game for me, in my opinion. Just wicked design though. So some of my favorite ones are the gold boss. So the one that is in this big coin vault. Just wicked boss design. The first one as well, it's a big creature or some sort of machine with a furnace in its chest, and grabs with a big hand and pulls material to feed the furnace, and just so cool. Another one is this, I think it's in the second level, is this turtle that comes flying on, and then it opens up, and this humanoid sort of creature, from the waist up anyway, comes out of the turtle shell and starts casting these watery spheres around itself, and it's just so cool. And then my absolute favorite, it's closely tied with a few, but it's easily one of my favorites, is this two-headed reptilian-like creature. It kind of looks like the snout of a dog or something, kind of like Cerberus almost. But it's reptilian, and just awesome colors, awesome design, just everything about these bosses is so good. So yeah, that's that. Everything just really fits to a T in terms of what they were wanting to capture here. They totally got it bang on. So in terms of visuals, like everything is spectacular and just so good. So music and sound effects, stellar retro style soundtrack. The songs don't just sound retro, they feel retro. Like, so if you grew up in the 80s and 90s like I did, and like, you know, songs inside and out and like how they flowed back then, that's like what these songs feel like. They've just got like the layers and just the different like cue changes, like everything. It just sounds phenomenal. So if you're into retro style music and games, like, this is a gold mine in that regard. There are some, of course, that like I like a little more than others, of course. Some of them aren't even super awesome or that captivated me, but there are a few that are just, they totally hit the sweet spot, like 100%. So like really awesome in that regard. Sound effects, great choices that really represent the era of gaming that they were going for. Like, they just, again, like, awesome job nailing that stuff. There isn't really much more that I'll say. Like, it really sounds like old school stuff when you're playing this. Okay, so on to gameplay and controls. You have like your basic jump, melee. You have a special weapon, which uses like weapon points. And then, of course, each character has like their own special abilities, which I'm going to get to like the character rundown a little more just a little later after I go over some other things. So, yeah, the game plays smoothly. When I first saw footage of the game, I thought like, oh, maybe that looks like it's going to be awkward, like some of the old school stuff played. But honestly, it was like pretty smooth. There were a few things that were a little strange, like just two things that actually I noticed, even though the rest of the game plays really smooth. So I'll mention those right now. The first is, when you're on a staircase, you are not able to jump. You're like literally locked in that position. So you're either, like, if you're being attacked, you're either going to move like up or down or whatever the case is. You're not jumping off anytime soon. So I found that to be like really out of place with just the rest of the game. And the second thing is, like, if you are up against a wall and you like, so here's the wall and there's like a platform here and you want to jump up, you have to be holding over before you jump. In a lot of games, you can jump up and then directional over, and your character will start moving over. So this kind of tripped me up a few times, because unless you are definitely holding over first, you're just going to be jumping straight up and nothing else will happen. So I got like I think I got something like flames to the face or some sort of projectiles, because it like messes up your timing when you aren't landing where you think you're going to land. And so whatever. So anyway, that's just something I noticed, or two things that I noticed. Okay, so getting back to gameplay, of course, the game keeps moving like steadily. Like, your character is always doing something. There's always obstacles that you want to avoid, or always enemies that you're going to be dealing with. So in that sense, like, there's a really nice progression in each level. You're always on your toes, and it just really feels like those old style challenge type games, and I think that's fantastic. Okay, and this is going to tie into bosses. They are especially cool, like the fighting and the maneuvers and the flow of the bosses. So for instance, I mentioned the furnace boss on the train, the coin vault boss, and the two-headed reptile boss. Those ones are by far my favorite, in terms of not just like the visuals like I mentioned, but just how you go about these bosses. So the furnace one, for instance, there are times where he'll do like the handle lunge and like pull, and you're required to like jump up onto what he's pulling into himself, And so there's a balance between being too close and not so close. Like you want to be able to get your hits in, but as he's like pulling it, it's like pulling you closer to him so you can then get hit. And then there are times where there's like a big blast, and so you want to be hiding behind one of these mounds that he was like pulling towards him. Just stuff like that. Like with the coin vault one, again, like big hands that are like pulling piles of gold, or pushing piles of gold across the room as you are hacking sections of it down to size so that you can use it as a step to get up to then hit the creature in the face. Like just really awesome stuff. I love things like that. And then the two-headed reptile, just a nice mix of the top head having like one type of attack with like these orbs that explode, and the bottom one doing like this snap and then like a flame blast. And then when you kill those two heads, they come back on the other side of the room, fuse together, and it's just wicked because like the bottom will kind of go like this and you want to be jumping over it, but there's also this huge fire blast that goes across the top. So like just awesome boss fights. So in terms of gameplay, like the bosses are definitely a highlight in my opinion. Okay, what else is there? Yeah, just a lot of fun. It's a really well-balanced game in terms of how it plays. Other than the two things that I mentioned with like the jumping and whatever. Like just awesome gameplay. Another thing that I really enjoyed about the game, you can destroy enemy projectiles, and that comes in handy because like there's so many times where you've got like 50 axes like just like flying all over the place, or just like arrows shooting like crazy, and just all sorts of chaos. So it really makes a difference when your melee attack can actually take out some of these physical objects. That is just handy. Another thing I liked is the alternate routes. So like if you're playing as Zangetsu, you might not be able to reach this one shortcut, but if you are playing as Gebel or you have access to him, you can just transform into a bat and fly across like a gap or whatever. And there are other times where like Miriam can like slide under a section that no one else could make their way through. So it's just really neat just doing different pathways and seeing how that plays out and seeing what you can bypass for like a shorter run or just a simpler time through the level. So that's a really neat thing. I also like that you can kill the characters that you would normally team up with if you chose to recruit them. It's just, you can, like, once you defeat the initial bosses, which trigger them, like, being like, oh, I'm saved, and now I'll, like, help you out or whatever, you can just choose to, like, hack them down right then and there, or you can choose to recruit them. So I think it's really neat that they throw that option in, and it will, of course, alter, like, how you play the game and what you have at your disposal. So that's, like, really sweet. Okay, so let's talk a little more in depth about the characters. So Zangetsu, okay, first off, they are all really well balanced except for Alfredo. He seemed just a touch behind the others, and I'll get into that more in like just a matter of minutes. But first, I'll go over the others. So Zangetsu, he is like a perfect close range fighter. He controls well. He has a decent range for just having his like sword or whatever. He just gets the job done, and I love, like, he's one of my primary characters, to be honest. Next is Miriam. Her maneuverability is just over the top in this game. Like, it's just so good. Like, she can slide, like I just mentioned. She has the high jump, so she can access ledges or things that the others might not be able to make. She has the whip that comes out and has the longest range out of all of the melee attacks. So she's just all around super useful in terms of like what she can do. Like whether it's destructible items like lamps or whatever you want to be destroying to collect items, or just bigger bosses like with timed attacks that you want to be taking out fast, but like being at a safer distance is something you're thinking about. Like all of these things, she's just an awesome killing machine, and yeah, is just so efficient. Like, so she was another one of my primary characters. Like, it would be either hers or Zangetsu. And then for other times, Gebel, because, yeah, he can fly. So you can be skipping sections, like I mentioned. For instance, there's like this one. It's not a pirate ship, but it's like a tattered ship of some sort. And there are like sections where normally you would like go back and forth, like working your way up. But if you're playing as Gebel, you can literally go up the staircase, fly just around this little corner, and then go up the next staircase, and you're avoiding like a big section of enemies and like all this other stuff. So that is super useful. Plus, he has like this attack that kind of like spreads out a diagonal spray of bats or something. And I found that really, really useful against a variety of enemies, like big guys that you're ducking under. Actually, the two-headed reptilian boss, if you checked out my replay, you'll see me using this method, his attack against the upper head. That's like super useful. He has a siphon ability, like where he can siphon blood. I don't think I ever actually used that once during the game, but that's there. So yeah, he is just all around really useful for just avoiding and just shaving off time here and there. So that's like really cool. Yeah, one thing I do want to mention with Miriam's high jump, just before I get too far ahead here, is that you really want to be careful with that because it's easy to over jump certain things. There's like this one section where you want to go for, I think it's a 1-up, but there's like rain and wind factoring into the gameplay as well. And so like you can go right off the edge. I did that like my first time. And there's another time where there's like something chasing you up these like platforms, and her jump is a little too high for my liking for that particular time. So just things like that, like you can overshoot easily with her in certain situations. For Alfredo, he's awesome with specific spells at specific times for specific enemies. And so like right there, that says it all. Like he is super useful at certain times, and otherwise, like sometimes when a character would die or he would be like my last remaining, it would just be like, oh great, I'm stuck with this fool. Like he just seemed like his melee attack is like, it just seems so short range. His jump is super short. Yeah, like it was just sometimes, a lot of the time, resorting to Alfredo was a drag, to be honest. And even though he was super useful at times, like he was just someone I didn't want to use, okay? Like I'm sure other people will have a different experience like with their playthroughs and stuff, but he was just kind of like, okay, use him only when he's the last person left, sort of thing. So, excuse me. Now, with the example I mentioned where there's something chasing you up the platforms, that was one time where his short jump was actually perfect. Like, you're not overshooting anything. I just found it to be really great, so I would typically use him for that part of the game. So that was cool. But overall, he just felt like underwhelming compared to the others and didn't really seem to pack a punch in a way that the others did, in like an overall sense anyway, except for those specific times, of course. So that's one thing that I like noticed. All right, oh man. Okay, so these are things that I was not into at all, and these are like some pretty big things. So first off, there was this one boss that is like, well, there are a couple of them, but it was like mainly the first one that I encountered because like I was figuring it out and whatever. But it's essentially a picture frame that animates and starts attacking or like flying across the room, and you want to kill it fast enough, because if you don't, it will pretty much insta-kill. It will ensnare one of your characters and then just kill it. And of course, if you know anything about the game, you'll know that when you die, you are transported to a spot earlier in the stage to then just repeat what you've already done to go back to that boss and then fight the same boss but with less characters, or like whichever one died. So I thought that was like really like pointless, to be honest, and it ties into like my other point that I'll just mention now, and it's the fact that like you can switch characters at any time, but when you die, you don't automatically shift to like the next available character. You get, like I just said, you get transported back. Like when you're in a boss fight, let's say a boss at the end of the level, for instance, when you're in that moment, to me it just makes sense that like you would want to stay in that like that energy and that like mentality and like just the excitement of that moment, or like the adrenaline. But for them to make it so that like you're just like, oh, okay, one character died and you have 2 or 3 left, but instead we're gonna pull you out of that atmosphere, plunge you into part of a level that you've already conquered, so that you are gonna just like gruel your way through it again and then encounter the same boss. Like none of that was necessary. They totally could have just streamlined the process by having it like automatically shift you to another character, and that way you're staying in the action. Like, yeah, like, oh man, like it doesn't make sense to me. Like for instance, if I was gonna resort to, like, let's say Zangetsu and Miriam died in a battle and I was down to just Gebel and Alfredo, even if they weren't the most suitable for whatever particular boss I was up against, at least it's like, okay, I know I've gotten the boss down this much. It's now or never. Like I want to be like, there would be determination, there would be motivation to really be resourceful in a situation like that, because you're like, okay, I haven't died yet. What can I do? How can I turn this around? But instead, like, you lose a single character and boom, you're back in the level going through stuff you've done already. Like, I didn't think that was, very interesting or very well designed. If they were going for some sort of like retro thing that maybe developers did way back, like they did not have to do it that way in this day and age, and they still would have done a fantastic job. So yeah, that was like a really, really big thing that I just found to be tedious, and I had no interest in that, to be honest. It's very rare that I don't love everything about a game. But yeah, in this game, it was enough. It was like more than enough to just be like, wow, that is such a turnoff. Why the hell did they do it that way? So anyway, let's just keep moving on. Okay, one last thing that I actually do want to mention, which I think the way I will word it is that, like, or the point that I'm getting at with all my like lack of interest in this whole like thing they set up, is that like the bosses are not super challenging in this game. When you know what to do, and you just do it, like no issue. But there will still be those times where you fumble something, you'll take extra damage or whatever the case, or you just enter the battle having taken extra damage that normally you wouldn't have. And so for those moments where you have a character that gets like killed off, anyway, like for you to be pulled out of that and put back into the level with like, yeah, whatever, it just doesn't seem like a very reasonable consequence. And like they could have just done a hell of a lot better. Anyway, okay, we are totally moving on now. Oh yeah, okay. Oh, we are not moving on yet, folks. Holy shit. Okay, so because of them setting it up that way, there would be times where I would literally, like, if a certain character died, like one that was very suitable for the boss fight, and like the others just sucked big time, there would be times where I would just be like, oh, well, that one character is gone. Like, I'm just gonna intentionally kill off the rest just so that I can start fresh. Like, when a game has that kind of, like, of course, that's my choice. Like, I'm not blaming them for that. But when a game has that potential in it, and I don't come across many games where I feel that way, but I felt that way a few times in this game, and I did that a few times in those types of situations. So when you have stuff like that happening, you just know something is up. So yeah, like, just not the coolest. Okay, so that more or less wraps up like the issues like that. The picture frame boss was just kind of like why are they doing this? The way they had the death system sorted out, like that was just kind of like nonsense to me. So that stuff aside, we will just move on to my final thoughts. So it is a super short game. My first playthrough when I was like figuring things out was about, I think, 2 hours 11 minutes. My second playthrough when I did the actual recording, I think came to just a little over an hour. So I'm thinking if I was to not be explaining things and admiring stuff and literally just playing to get through the level as quickly as possible, not, and I don't mean speed running, but I just mean like going through it without the focus of like engaging the audience, it would probably be less than an hour, to be honest, easily. No questions asked. So yeah, it's very short. It is a really neat dip into the retro style experience. Like that's really cool. It's a great action adventure platformer. Like I enjoyed my time with it. It has replay value, but to be honest, I don't really want to play it right now. I know I will totally play it again later. I have no idea when. It could be a year, 2 years, 5 years. I just know, like, even though it has the whole like new game plus sort of thing going on, I don't really feel like playing it back to back, even though I could crush it in an hour or less. So, and like that's comparing to some games where I was so immersed that I do play back to back files, like on normal mode and then hard mode, because it's just so good and you just want to like do it again. That wasn't really the case for me anyway. Also, like, I understand that it was like a side project to tide people over, but it almost seemed like there were huge parts of the game that felt very underwhelming. The story, for instance, like I get that a plot doesn't have to be this like big elaborate thing, but it felt like there really wasn't much going on story wise that was really engaging me. And another thing, the final boss seemed really underwhelming as well. I thought the design of the final boss was like really dumb looking, to be honest. They could have easily just designed some badass demon, but instead it was just like this dorky looking whatever. So like that wasn't super interesting for me, but whatever, like it is what it is. All in all, like it's a cool enough game. There are some major highlights, like I mentioned, like the music, the visuals, like the fun bosses, like some of the earlier ones, just awesome. That just packed so much punch to the game. But even with those in mind, it kind of like the entirety felt sort of just like short-lived and underwhelming in some ways. Okay, like I really enjoyed it, and yet it's still kind of feeling underwhelming. So that's all I can really say on that, to be honest. Okay, so the $10 price tag, I think for me it was like $11.61 Canadian. I feel that's reasonable. Like I'm certainly not complaining about the price for like, what you get. I think it's like a great addition to the like Switch library. I'm glad to have the game. If they had a physical release for like maybe $30, I would have gone with that over a $10 or even like a cheaper digital version any day. Like I would totally go for the physical. If it was coming out at like 45, like, oh God, I'm not, like I would want it just for the sake of like collecting the physical version, but I would not really want to pay that much for this game, to be honest. Okay, so yeah, that is gonna wrap this up. I pretty much went off about everything I wanted to, and I think I touched on everything that was like definitely noteworthy. If I forgot anything, I can always mention that at a later date. But yeah, anyway, I was just like dealing with a pile of notes here. I want to make use of like both sides of some scrap pieces of paper, so hence the pile of uh, papes. But anyway, thank you guys so much for watching. Definitely leave your comments below. I think it would be great to hear some feedback, get into some discussion. If you agree with some of these points that I made, if you've played the game yourself, if you haven't but you were wanting to, but maybe you're having second thoughts based on like certain things, just any of that stuff, definitely leave it below and I will be sure to read that over. Please like, subscribe. If you enjoyed this, a subscribe would be awesome. If not, that's great too. But anyway, have an awesome day and I will see you next time.